Hello, everyone. What I'd like to present today is the controversies around the concept of style in the architecture of the 20th and 21st centuries. The concept of style was introduced into the history of art by Winckelmann, who tied it with the ideals of classicism and gave it normative values. Winckelmann's concept contained contradiction resulting from the recognition that the art of ancient Greece had timeless values and at the same time the assumption that the source of perfect art was specific geographic and political conditions. The value created in connection with the specific place can therefore not be universal and developed outside the circumstances of its occurrence. Meanwhile, Winckelmann assumed that art created under different conditions should imitate the Greek and be judged according to it. A mistake of Winckelmann's theory was also to idealize ancient art without knowing it closely, including disregard for Doric buildings and praising the works of Hellenic period. Winckelmann's view that ancient art were kept in white when in fact were polychrome also had a long-lasting influence. Winckelmann's special achievement, however, was the division of Greek art into 4 styles: archaic, tall, beautiful, and epigones. For the first time, divisions were introduced into the vast wealth of Greek culture, ordering its manifestation by defining the distinctive visual and content values of group of works. Despite the passage of many centuries, some elements of concept of style introduced by Winckelmann survived in later variants of understanding the concept of style, just as the predilection for whiteness and simplicity turned out to be permanent. Combining the formal feature of art with the circumstances of its production turned out to be most influential. The antiquating whiteness and simplicity returned in Le Corbusier theories, especially in Théodore architecture. The concept of style was associated with historical changes in the philosophy of Hegel, who assumed the existence of 3 periods in art: symbolic, classical, and romantic. Hegel's continuators in research into art were already historians in this field, especially Heinrich Gustav Otto, editor of Hegel's lectures on aesthetics. The influence of Hegelian historicism led to an increase in periodization and introduction of many style names. In the concept of Heinrich Welfin, a distinction was made between the artist style, the national style, and styles related to historical epochs. The connection of art with the ideological content of the epoch was made thanks to Max Dvořák, who was most strongly influenced by Hegelian historiography. The direct connection of artistic forms and ideas, however, aroused polemics. The history of art of Abbe Warburg and Erwin Panofsky expressed the desire to point to specific philosophical sources of content of works of art, more precisely than Dvořák, at the same time ignored the formal values. Warburg's analysis, especially the article Italienische Kunst und internationale Astrologie im Palazzo Schifanoia in Ferrara, focused on indicating selected contents of philosophical text. According to his theory, the Wechselwart illustrated this content. Unlike Warburg, Panofsky also recommended taking into account the influence of more general ideological trends on Wechselwart. The dependence of research methods on Hegel's philosophy, characteristic on the history of art, was questioned in Lorenz Dittmann's book Stil, Symbol, Struktur, Studien zu Kategorien der Kunstgeschichte. The decisive act of undermining historicism in art history, however, was Ernst Grombeck's publication In Search of Cultural History. Gombrich based his critique of art history on the work of science methodologist Karl Raimund Popper, and in particular on the 1957 book, The Poverty of Historicism. Further criticism of historicism in art history focused on the negation of iconology and was presented in the article by Oskar Bechmann, Beiträge zu einem Übergang vor der Ikonologie zur kunstgeschichtlichen Hermeneutik, and the book, but the same author, Einführung in die kunstgeschichtliche Hermeneutik. The next stage in the development of art history became hermeneutics, abandoning the study on the relationship between art and the historical circumstances of its creation, and based on the broader critique of scientific consciousness contained in the philosophy of Gadamer. The separation of the history of architecture from the area of art shows a similar course of changes in this field, a role similar to Gombrich's lectures published in Search of Cultural History, was played in the History of Architecture by David Watkin's lectures, published in the book Morality and Architecture, the Development of Theme in Architectural History and Theory from Gothic Revival to Modern Movement. Watkin too read his work under the influence of Hegel's critique and historicism depicted in Popper's works. Watkin interpreted the views of Pugin, Viollet-le-Duc, Lefebvre, Le Corbusier, Gideon, and Pevsner as wrongly assuming the existence of a transcendent source of changes in architecture. Pugin decided that the aesthetic power of God comes from God himself, who is will included in the tradition of Catholic Church. In his doctrine, creation in the Gothic style gained the rank of the realization of God's will, and the Gothic was the result of learning principles based on divine necessity. The scheme assuming the metaphysical origin of the forms of architecture was secularized according to Hegel's philosophy. Absolute reason descended from God, which manifests itself in the ideological values of a given epoch. Absolute is immanently involved in the development of wealth, which take place in stages. The stages of development can be defined as cultural ages or styles. originally the absolute spirit we reveal as a divine force organized by religion, but also gained visibility in the characteristic of works of art. In Hegel's time, philosophy was a representative form of the manifestation of universal reason, but art also displayed the rationality of a given epoch. The rationality could be read both in art forms, as Max Dvorak did, but also the ideas behind the representation shown in works of art as described by Erwin Panofsky in his works. The ideas of the epoch were also responsible for the subsequent stages of creating a perfect society in which architecture played its part. In the 19th century, the features of an optimal society were the growth of rationality in its organization, getting rid of the remains of religion, democratism, egalitarianism, and communitarianism, focus on the common good. Architecture could maintain its rank only in harmony with the trends of its era, thus becoming more rational and rejecting old tradition based on the cult on individualism and aestheticism. Of the principles mentioned once by Vitruvius and later by Alberti, that is, firmitas, utilitas, venustas, the most important in the new era was to be the principle of utility. In line with the views on increasing the role of rationality in society and architecture, Viollet-le-Duc interpreted Gothic architecture as a manifestation of the activity of groups of city dwellers who were precursors of scientists sought to gain power in the new society. The works were a result of growing architectural knowledge and discoveries in the field of mathematics, geometry, and statics. For Viollet-le-Duc, the cathedrals were a triumph of rationalism and the work of Freemasons seeking to seize power in society, and therefore also architects a new society. The view about the rationality of the cathedral and its dependence on scholastic philosophy was maintained in his lectures by Panofsky, while the idea of architecture as a form political action appeared in Le Corbusier's essayist book, Toward an Architecture. The continuation of doctrine of Pugin and Viollet-le-Duc was contained in the writings of the English architect and critic William Lefebvre, the content of which was later developed by architects, theorists, and promoters of modernist architecture. In Lefebvre's opinion, Gothic was the result of the development of technology and team activities. As a consequence, he assumed that architecture, like shipbuilding, should get rid of individualism, references to art, and become the result of collective work and an emanation of collective wisdom. This direction of thinking appeared in theories of Walter Gropius, Le Corbusier, and Mies van der Rohe. The aesthetic value of works of these architects was concealed by claim that the role of function and meeting the needs of users is the most important. Each of them introduced effective forms into architecture resulting from the personal talents, but at the same time, they proclaimed that they created works resulting from the objective values of the development of civilization, as if from the manifestations of absolute reason manifested by the development of science and technology. The aspiration to build collective societies were also treated as a historical necessity, which should be taken into account in the organization of architectural work. Architects would support the rational tendencies of their era and enable the emergence of brave new world. Such a vision of architecture resulted from texts written by supporters of modernist architects who hid behind the rhetoric of objectivism and scientific values. Nikolaus Pevsner, Emil Kaufmann, Siegfried Giedion, and Henry Russell Hitchcock. The problem with the historiography of modernist architecture is the fact that in its mainstream, it does not take into account the rank of modernist architecture of a non-avant-garde character, including expressionism, Art Deco architecture, and a long list of classicism in the 20th century, such as the Secole style, the year 1937. Expressionism of Max Berg, Erich Mendelssohn, or the masters of the Secole Backstein expressionism should also be included in the trend modernist architecture, but they did not hide behind theories and aspiration typical of revolutionary architects of the avant-garde trend. Similar statements can also be made works of Art Deco architecture and classicism. They were therefore works of modernism, but not of the avant-garde. The second problem in the historiography of modernism is the occurrence of the description that differ in detail. In the four characteristics that avant-garde modernism cannot be clearly defined, and its characteristics depend on the value system represented by historians. Modernism, in the description of researches related to the avant-garde architects community, is therefore the product of gifted scientific writers rather than a reflection of actual architecture. Despite attempts to verify this traditional opinion about avant-garde modernism, they are still popular. Scientific literature strongly influence, above all, on behavior of architects. He followed the vision created by historians. The strongest suggestions came from the works of Nikolaus Pevsner, Emil Kaufmann, Siegfried Giedion, and Henry Russell Hitchcock, who, although they declared as scientific and objective position, were closely associated with representative of avant-garde modernism. Giedion was influential Secretary General of CIAM, and Hitchcock, the organizer of the exhibition Architectura Propaganda in 1932. The involvement of these historians in the development of modern architecture is revealed by the terms they use, especially those characterized by rhetorical pathos. For Pevsner, modernist architecture was supposed to be healthy, sincere, and honest, in contrast to 19th century architecture being decorative, basteful, and dishonest. Similarly, Hitchcock wrote about the architecture he promoted, who claimed that it's wonderful, amazing, and full of splendor. It was also characteristic of this group of historians to focus their attention on the appearance of buildings. In the description, modernist architecture was elegant, characterized by simplicity, reduced to geometric forms, and composing set of solids into a regular group, but without the use of symmetry. Each of them saw some peculiarities, but all individual observation only supplemented the basic catalog of aesthetic values. Kaufmann noticed the use of smooth walls and placing windows directly in cutout of the facade, or the use of flat roofs, but this was only a confirmation on the aesthetics based on geometric simplicity and lack of ornaments. For the next group of historians, Rainer Banham or Bruno Zevi, early modernism represented simplified classicism, and the works of Adolf Loos, Peter Behrens, Walter Gropius, Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe contained numerous elements modeled on ancient architecture. Le Corbusier Villa Savoie or Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion, as well as long series of further buildings by the above-mentioned architects, we consider transformation of ancient temples. However, Peter Collins did not support the criticism of the classicism tails in contemporary architecture, who believed that the new architecture is a summary of the best achievements of former, thus a variant of classicism of principles. It should be remembered that for Bruno Zevi, all references to classicism were associated with the fascism he condemned, or more generally, with authoritarianism. The aforementioned group of historians discovered the lack of radical innovation previously assumed in modernist architecture. The use of classical architecture was assessed both negatively and positively. The lack of agreement in defining avant-garde modernism also second-sent the social sources of style. For Pevsner, modernism was part of a new collective society, while Hitchcock believed the changes in architecture resulted from the autonomous development of artistic values. For Leonardo Benevolo, the changes, the appearance of works did not matter, but he suggested that architects consciously participate in political life and that the activities were aimed at solving social problems and creating a new society. Collins, as a representative of the second generation of historians, objected and argued that modernism cannot be defined by a set of formal features because they are the result of social changes. Contradictions in the description of modernism have already appeared in the first group of historians, in Pevsner, Kaufmann, Gedeon, and Hitchcock. The next generation, Bruno Zevi, Leonardo Benevolo, Rainer Banham, Peter Collins, criticize the narratives of the predecessors in many details. From the end of the 1960s, a period of strong criticism of modernism in architecture began. Books by Jane Jacobs, Peter Blake, Tom Wolfe, and Roger Scruton temporarily changed the positive assessment of style in general perception. The criticism resulted in the rise of neo-modernism, in which perceived shortcomings of the style we removed on alternative form of reaction with postmodernism, which was a different type response to the errors pointed out by critics. The theory of postmodernism was shaped mainly by Charles Zengs, although alternative versions of the main distinguishing features of the style we also formulated by Peter Blake and Heinrich Klotz. Postmodernism was greeted with enthusiasm and hope by a wide audience and supported by conservative theorists such as Rob Kria and Nikos Salingaros. Attempt to maintain decorativism using quotation from ancient architecture as well other features of postmodern architecture have shown its weakness, and after 2 decades it has lost its attractiveness. Currently, only versions of neoclassicism are eagerly judged by authoritarian, nationalist, and populist governments, as shown by the example of reconstruction of Skopje. The solution to the problem of the further development of architecture at the turn of 20th and 21st centuries is included in the consideration on postmodernism by Heinrich Klotz. Klotz saw a poetic value in postmodernism, but he interpreted the concept of poetry in a specific sense. Poetry has been identified with the metaphysics of architecture with its original foundations. Contemporary architecture is therefore characterized by a critical reflection not only on history, but above all on its original principles. Therefore, if dealing with postmodernism and neo-modernism at the same time, they are linked by reaching beyond all past, which is clearly present in the architecture of deconstructivism. The architecture of Bernard Tschumi or Peter Eisenman can be classified as neo-modernism, but it is represented by historicism reaching primordiality. The study of the metaphysics of architecture is a philosophical activity, but philosophy is created not within discourse contained in the text, but in buildings, which only secondary in the process of interpretation can be transformed into narrative with the use of writing. The works is therefore not an illustration of the text, but the text brings the work to meaning and intelligibility. Since the 1990s, neo-modernism has dominated the field of architecture, but it has done so in a radically pluralistic way. Only the essential values hold this style together, which currently cannot be defined as a style, because it has no common visual distinguishing features. The trends of neo-modernism are linked by a critical reflection entire tradition of architecture, including its primary and transcendental principles, and characterized by a personal responsibility solving artistic and social problems. What neo-modernism has in common with early modernism is the pursuit of a better, more democratic society. Thank you so much for interest and attention.